Warning, this episode of the Seriously Wrong podcast is going to give welfare benefits to the rich and bootstraps to everyone else. This episode is going to protect the owner's property rights by an increased budget for the police force while cutting education budgets, increasing crime. This episode is going to reduce every aspect of the human experience to markets. It is going to assume that you are a rational podcast consumer making informed decisions. This podcast is meritocratic, and only the best will listen.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Seriously Wrong podcast, the only podcast that will pull your bootstraps up for you. My name is Aaron.
My name is Shawn.
And we're doing an episode about neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism. 7 syllables.
This is way too many syllables for one word.
I mean, in general, yes. It's a big-ass word.
Neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism could be the long sentence of a haiku.
Yeah, we should write a book of haikus where the middle line is always neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism is a term that has come to mean a great number of things, specifically on the academic left. We want to get to the bottom of it. So many people use this word. What the hell are they talking about?
The mystery of the neoliberalism. Can you help me, wrong boys? Can you help me with this? Yes, we can help you.
Yeah, anyone who calls our hotline 1-866-770-8754 and asks us a question where they refer to us as the wrong boys, we will do an episode about your question. Just call us the wrong boys.
Please. We love it.
We love it. Plead that we get to the bottom of it.
Oh, please, wrong boys. Please.
Help me get to the bottom of it.
Just a heads up, in this episode, there's going to be more than one clip of both Noam Chomsky and Slavoj Žižek. I'm not going to introduce them every time, but you'll know Žižek because of his thick accent and Chomsky because it's not Žižek.
This word, I've heard it for years, and I felt like I understood it. But I also felt like I couldn't describe how it was defined concisely.
Yeah, I actually felt like I never understood it until I started listening to a few lectures to prepare for this episode.
I had this vague idea of it where it's an imposing academic sounding, could make you kind of perceived as like elitist or something. Like it has that academic left strong connotation.
Yeah, I mean, long words that are already like widely misunderstood and applied in many different ways, and then you're like, add a prefix on there, add neo onto liberalism, and it's like, okay, well, what did you mean by liberalism when you're saying this? What makes it neo? Very quickly, it becomes hard to follow the conversation unless it's a conversation you're immersed in, and then it's just very easy to understand what's being talked about. Because I feel like I was intimidated by the word, or like felt like it was this really big, difficult thing to understand. But once I started looking into it, I found that it actually doesn't seem to be that difficult to understand. There is definitely some vagueness and some people use it in different ways, but the general gestalt of what it's trying to point to is pretty clear.
What I would boil it down to, although I think there's some contradictory definitions, neoliberalism is the use of free market rhetoric to hide actions that are more aligned with crony capitalism, insider dealing, corruption in government. It's using the framing of the marketplace, the ideology of the marketplace, to hide systemic intentional corruption and insider dealing.
A few catchphrases I saw thrown around was privatization of profits and socialization of costs, and the other one was markets for the poor, socialism for the rich.
Yeah, and I think that's really the heart of what is being criticized when you're reading articles critical of neoliberalism, is this pattern, which is a kind of global pattern, where there's this idea of free markets for you, protected markets for us.
Taking the rhetoric of liberal economists meaning like hardcore free market advocates, and using that to deregulate or to privatize the economy, but only to do that in the areas where it's going to benefit the people with a lot of wealth. Like, they're not after the governments to deregulate things that aren't going to be beneficial for them.
So in practice, that ends up being stronger police forces and tax cuts for the rich, budget cuts for social services, things like education and welfare, a commodification of everything, taking public infrastructure like power plants and these type of things, telecommunications networks that were funded by government investment and proved to be profitable, privatizing them, which is a euphemism for selling them to your friends, so your friends make the money instead of the government.
Also, on a global scale, the idea of opening up markets to foreign investment, which in a lot of less wealthy countries means having transnational corporations come in and extract the resources and take the profits for themselves, basically leaving the people in the country with maybe some crappy jobs to go work at, but none of the real wealth that's being like taken out from under their feet because they don't have the means to extract it and use it in the global market. They're going to end up being dominated by the people who dominate every market economy, the people who have the power, the people who have the money.
If you're putting in policy changes where you're going to privatize public infrastructure and at the same time open your country up to outside investment, usually what you're creating is a situation where rich people in foreign countries are taking control of the energy and natural resources of these regions, which, according to some free market ideologues, is good for the economy, but obviously comes at the cost of depriving the people of that nation of the capacity to share in that wealth, and ends up artificially putting countries into poverty even though they have immense resource wealth and labor capital.
Yeah, it's where the criticisms you'll hear of globalization come from. Like, I think for some people it's counterintuitive because a lot of people think of globalization as this positive thing where we're all coming together as a globe and we can all talk to one another now, and like, what's the deal with borders? But one of the points that Chomsky was making in this thing I was listening to was that in practice, removing at least economic borders between countries ends up making it so that the resource wealth for those countries doesn't go to help the actual people in those countries. So there's a kind of like economic nationalism that he was talking about being a socialist idea or a positive thing for those countries.
It's kind of like, free markets for you, protectionism for us. In the same way, it's like open borders for us, closed borders for you.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you want to run away from a war-torn area? You're a refugee? It's like, well, I don't know. Maybe it's got to close some of those borders.
Yeah,
but
you can't run away from a war zone. But if you want to invest in our country,
yeah, free flow of capital. Like, if you buy stocks in Apple, and we'll come and set up oil rigs in your country. It's fair trade, free trade. It's beautiful.
Whoa! You can't come and live here now. But I will sell you a cell phone if you want.
Do you have 7-Elevens in your country? Do you need 7-Elevens? Where do you get your Coca-Cola? You don't
have Coca-Cola?
You don't have Coca-Cola. It's great. It's delicious.
It is this amazing sugar water that we invented over here. No, you don't need to come. No, don't come over to... No, Coca-Cola will come to you.
Oh, God.
One of the interesting things today is that precisely states which follow in a too direct, stupid way, which take neoliberalism too seriously, suffer the consequences. Look at the countries which everyone would agree are capitalism in its most violent, destructive expansion. Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, China. These are all of them countries with an extremely strong regulatory function of the state. So we should distinguish in neoliberalism between its ideology, or market liberalism, and what is effectively going on today, even in the United States, in defense and all social service, whatever, not social services, they are diminishing. But I don't think that United States as a state apparatus was ever stronger than today. No, capitalists cheat here. Neoliberalism, in this sense, states should intervene less, leave the market to decide. It's a stupid ideology to screw up third world countries and to destroy them. They themselves don't really follow this. United States quite ruthlessly support their own industries. They break all the neoliberal. Look how already Bush saved the American steel works by breaking all the neoliberal rules and supporting them with great donations and so on and so on. This is, I think, an important lesson. Neoliberalism is not one big homogeneous system where IMF rules, we have all to follow that dictate. No. The situation is much more complex, inconsistent, and there are things which can be done.
Yeah, the other thing that really stuck out to me as a way that is helpful for understanding the context of it, in the history of the United States, there's the Great Depression happening, and FDR gets elected, and his basic policy is what's called Keynesianism. He starts spending a whole lot of money to try and spend his way out of the Depression. Some people say it worked great. Some people say it looked like it worked, but it was actually the war, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so the basic idea is that the general policy of the United States between the 1930s and up to about the 1970s was Keynesian. And then towards the end of the 1970s, and especially in the early 80s, when Reagan is in office, there's a major switch made from Keynesian ideas, from let's have the government spend a lot on social programs, let's invest in Medicare or create Medicare as a new thing, and all these things, set up this welfare state, switch to let's start defunding those things, let's start privatizing, let's start liberalizing the economy. And so that was Reagan. And one of his chief money people, the head of the Federal Reserve, he instituted was Alan Greenspan, and I guess he's kind of seen as a key figure in neoliberalism, and he held that position up until the Obama administration, when Obama did have him for a while, and then he switched to Bernanke, and Bernanke was in there for a while until just recently. But yeah, that's the history. The history is the big economic power, the United States, was operating under Keynesianism for a few decades, and then there was a resurgence in economic liberalism and privatization, and that resurgence is called neoliberalism. So what you're talking about with neoliberalism is this specific way that market rhetoric was implemented by Reagan, by Thatcher in the UK, and the general policies that were set in place there that continued on throughout the 80s, the 90s, and into the 2000s. So yeah, it's a way of describing what has been happening, the effects of market ideology on real-world economic policy in the last 35 years and since the 80s.
Neoliberalism is kind of like the free market version of Stalinism or Leninism, or specific implementations of communism around the world that people would say, that's not real communism.
Right. Yeah. It'd be like neoliberalism's not real free markets. It's a specific example.
But it uses the rhetoric and the ideology of free market ideals, but in practice, it can be really clearly demonstrated to not really be dedicated all that much to free markets, in the same way that I would say Soviet Russia famously was not devoted to the well-being of its people.
Yeah, to the best versions of communism that you can pull out of Marx. It definitely isn't what was happening there. Yeah.
So here's one definition of neoliberalism from Paul Mason, who writes for The Guardian. This is from his book, Postcapitalism. Neoliberalism is the doctrine of uncontrolled markets. It says the best route to prosperity is individuals pursuing their self-interest, and the market is the only way to express that self-interest. It says the state should be small, except for its riot squad and secret police, that financial speculation is good, that inequality is good, that the natural state of humankind is to be a bunch of ruthless individuals competing with each other. Its prestige rests on tangible achievements. In the past 25 years, neoliberalism has triggered the biggest surge in development the world has ever seen, and it unleashed an exponential improvement in core information technologies. But in the process, it has revived inequality to a state close to that of 100 years ago, and has now triggered a survival-level event.
That's another thing that came up a lot during what I was reading, the idea of the massively widening gap in wealth globally and in any specific country you care to look at, basically, of the last 35, 40 years since the 70s is sort of the result of neoliberal policy. This is what starts happening in places where you implement this. Whereas if you look at the period between, say, the 30s and the 70s, there was a sort of real gain in wealth for working class people in America. And since the 70s, that hasn't really been the case. You look at things that say wages in real terms are either down or stagnant, education costs skyrocketing, and education becoming a thing where it's supposed to prepare people to play cogs in this neoliberal capitalist machine. Education becomes directed by those economic interests rather than by like some pure academic interest.
I think one of the confusing things about this enormous polysyllabic pejorative word used only by left-wing people, neoliberalism, in addition to the policies in the real world and the ideology that sustains those policies and the rhetoric that sustains those policies, the power relations between nations adds an additional layer of confusion because neoliberalism is at one time the economic relationship between poor countries and rich countries. It's the policies being implemented in countries around the world like privatization and welfare cuts. And it is at the same time the ideology that says that we are primarily economic agents and everything should be measured in terms of the marketplace. The three are connected, but they're used in different ways at different times. And I think it's part of the reason that making a clear, quick definition of neoliberalism is so hard.
Yeah, it's an important thing what you mentioned about it being essentially a pejorative. Like, I don't think there's anybody who goes around saying I'm a neoliberal. Generally, like when I've seen thought leaders pointed to as neoliberals, a lot of the time they're people that could be considered like classically liberal or neoclassically liberal economists or even Austrian economists. And so I think it's seen as sort of a snarl word or a word that maybe people who like markets, who agree with different versions of market ideology, hear the word and they feel attacked by it and they try and wade into this morass of trying to understand what it means. And they want to kind of take all of that and just throw it out because they're saying this isn't even a real ideology. This is just a pejorative. But I think to just say it's a pejorative might be a bit of an oversimplification. I think it's definitely a criticism, that it exists only as criticism. But I think what is being criticized is an important phenomena to isolate and to have a name for. So I think I just want to put a flag down and say I think that it's a valuable word, or maybe it would be better if it was a different word that wasn't 7 syllables, but it's valuable to have a word to describe what neoliberalism is trying to describe.
Yeah, an argument that I saw against the use of the term because of its political nature is kind of the idea that your ability to have a meaningful debate is hampered by having strong politically charged pejoratives be part of the discussion. There's part of me that agrees with that in the sense that I think maybe in certain scholarly intellectual contexts, we should try to remove words like that from our vocabulary. Like if you want to have an honest, long conversation about the global financial system and the global economy and the ideology that supports that, you're going to want to talk about those things as distinct and try to avoid using pejoratives that come to moral or intellectual conclusions from the get-go. But neoliberal as a piece of rhetoric and also as a thinking tool, I think also has value. So I think that there's some truth to the idea that pejorative terms can like limit thought or frame debate in a way that might be disadvantageous in some circumstances, but I think I totally agree with you that it's a useful word. It refers to something that very little, like the connection between this rhetoric and the cronyism is a very explicit connection that can be observed in the real world and deserves to be criticized.
Yeah, it's like, it annoys me too when people talk about Stalinism or talk about Soviet Russia as just communism. It's like, that's communism. That's what communism did. I understand not wanting your pure ideology to be mixed up and sullied by these terrible real world examples of it trying to be put into effect. But just like I think it's valid to criticize Stalinism and even to criticize communist thought in terms of Stalinism and what happened, it's legitimate to criticize neoliberalism and free market ideology in terms of neoliberalism and in terms of what's been happening in the world in the last 35 years. Like one of the main criticisms you hear of free market ideologies is that this thing called a pure free market is like a mythical beast that could never actually happen. And when you try to implement it in the real world, it ends up with all these awful things. Many of those examples are what could be considered neoliberalism. And similarly, people make criticisms of communism and say, when you actually try to implement it in the real world, all these awful things happen. Look at Stalin, look at Mao. And I think those are both legitimate lines of discussion to talk about. I don't think that either of the ideologies should be fully defined by specific things that happened, but I think talking about them in terms of each other is good and useful and needs to happen.
Yeah, I've got this paper here, Neoliberalism from New Liberal Philosophy to Anti-Liberal Slogan. They went through academic journals looking for the word neoliberalism and created data sets based on how neoliberalism was used and in what context. There was a strong tendency towards criticism, that if someone's using neoliberalism, they're using it because they're critical of free markets. And they described it as an asymmetrical pattern of use. In one sense, I could see how someone could use that as a way to try to discount the word as having like an ideological baggage, having an emotional conception buried in the definition of it. But I think I want to take the opposite approach and say that the problem with the asymmetric pattern of use is that free market advocates aren't talking about neoliberalism on the terms of the critics of their ideology. And that if they did, you can be someone who favors markets, who thinks that there's room for markets in society and favors market solutions to many or all problems or some problems. And that in that context, differentiating yourself from neoliberalism and acknowledging the pattern of implementations of these ideas that benefit the rich, exacerbate income inequality, cause social problems, require the increase in growth of police departments and prisons. Being able to acknowledge and talk about neoliberalism while distinguishing your version of what you want to see happen would be beneficial. Because I think the current situation with that asymmetry of use is like if communists never talked about failed communist projects, and if you tried to bring up failed communist projects, you'd be like, oh, that's a meaningless word. What are you even talking about?
Even communists who say Stalinism isn't real communism will talk about Stalinism. Like, it's helpful that Stalinism isn't called like neo-communism or something, but you can still admit Stalinism exists and criticize Stalinism from a communist perspective, the same way you could criticize neoliberalism from a classical liberal perspective or a libertarian perspective, whatever you call your ideology at this point.
Or defend Stalinism or defend neoliberalism. Say like, no, this power imbalance between nations has these benefits and we need to have this. And like, these ideological points make sense, or we need to incorporate some of these ideological points and reject some of them.
I want to start a blog that just has a whole bunch of really counterintuitive defenses of things, like a libertarian's defense of Stalinism or a Marxist defense of neoliberalism or something like that. You're identifying yourself in a thread on Facebook as a center-right pragmatist for Bernie Sanders. It still tickles me. It's just like, it's like people see him as this like super left, non-pragmatic person and just be like, oh yeah, no, I'm a center-right pragmatist for Bernie Sanders. It's beautiful.
Anyway, maybe my conception of the political spectrum is distorted compared to other people's, but the part of me that supports Bernie Sanders is on my center right.
Right, yeah. and your pragmatic side. Like, he's electing a radical leftist in terms of what I think a radical leftist is. It just would be like, I'm just trying to imagine what an average centrist in America would think of this person, like how far left of Bernie Sanders they are.
Yeah, my Facebook friends list is split up between people who think that Bernie Sanders is like an evil permutation of an irredeemable system and people who think that he is the lone progressive beacon in a world of horror.
Yeah.
Personally, I fall somewhere in between, but I support him.
Some people are describing the kinds of energies that are going into the Sanders campaign as part of a global phenomenon. We have Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and in Greece, which has been burdened so traumatically by austerity. We have Alexis Tsipras of the left-wing Syriza party. And I was curious as to what you thought, if something more universal is driving the kind of enthusiasm for the left in this moment.
Not just this moment. Every place that the neoliberal principles have been applied, it's been harmful to the general populations. In the United States, which is not harmed as much as others, a rich, powerful society, there's been basically stagnation or decline for about 30 years. People are now arguing about the minimum wage, but if you take a look at the minimum wage, through the huge growth period, 50s and 60s, it tracked productivity. That started to break the late 70s when the neoliberal assault began. If the minimum wage had continued to do so, it would now probably be about $20 an hour. So when people are talking about $15 an hour, they're saying, let's keep it low. Real male wages are now roughly what they were in the late 60s. It's been pretty flat ever since, the Reagan-Thatcher neoliberal assault. And the same is true. It's taking a different form in Europe, a worse form in many ways. Greece, Spain, England have been targeted by very reactionary economic policies, even worse than here. The idea of austerity during recession, even the IMF thinks it's ridiculous. And from an economic point of view, yes, sure, it's an absurdity, but that doesn't mean it's foolish. It's a very good instrument of class war. It's undermining the major achievements of Europe since the Second World War, both political and social and economic. What we call welfare state programs are being significantly undermined, England as well.
Show me what democracy looks like.
This is what democracy looks like.
Show me what democracy looks like.
This is what democracy.
Prime Minister Aaron, what? There's civil unrest in the streets. What should we do?
Shawn, my trusted advisor. I've been studying a lot. I've been reading a lot about economics, some of the greats, and I have all the answers. So why don't you bring me each and every one of the problems? Why are the people in the streets? And I'll bestow the solutions upon you.
Mr. Prime Minister, there is a problem with systemic unemployment. There are more laborers than we have jobs, and welfare rates are too low. What should we do?
What we have to do is take more of the money that we would have been giving to them for welfare and give it to the people who can create more jobs for them. So Coca-Cola, for example, let's give Coca-Cola $1 billion. $1 billion that would have just given $3 each to the people in the country. They can't do anything with it. $3. What can any individual person do with $3? Nothing. What can Coca-Cola do with $1 billion? They can create, I don't know the exact numbers, but 1 billion jobs.
Prime Minister, we've got a major problem in our financial sector. It seems that there's systemic corruption in the industry. They were selling liar's loans, which are loans that they know could not possibly be paid back. They were misrepresenting the quality of those loans to mislead investors and make profit, and they were actually, in many cases, betting against them being paid back. So fully aware of what they were doing. It's causing a recession.
Well, what we don't want is the people who have their money in those banks to lose that money, everyday workers. So we have to make sure these banks stay solvent first. So there's a crisis, we give them a whole bunch of money, a whole heap load of money. I don't even want to say how much money. I'm just going to write the number down on a piece of paper and I will point to it. It's right there.
Sir, that's an enormous amount of That's
yeah,
a huge amount of money.
It's a lot of money. I know. All these things, they're doing debt instruments. So saying, I don't really understand those things. The people who understand those things are the people participating in it. And so I think they're the best people to advise me on how it should be regulated. And the feedback I'm getting is that it's fine. What we need to do is leave it just how it is. If anything, there's probably been too much regulation. So we should lower their taxes and cut welfare.
Sir, we are approaching a crisis point. The rate of global warming is faster than anticipated, and we're going to be dealing with catastrophic sea rise within 15, 20 years, and unpredictable weather. It's looking to be quite bad. What should we do?
The only way we're going to avert climate change is if we have a vibrant energy economy. So what we need to do is get out of the way and let the market build up renewables, build up wind farms, build up hydroelectricity. So what we need to do is cut taxes on the energy companies, the ones that are right now pulling oil out of the ground, because that's the only thing that's profitable. They don't have enough money to experiment and do the R&D needed to usher in the next form of energy. And in order to pay for that, we're probably going to need to lower welfare payments to the poor.
So there are bloggers campaigning that your cabinet is too heavily dominated by white males, and there's only one woman in your cabinet. What can we do?
Well, I think the real way to get more women in politics and to get more women elected is to bring women into the marketplace, okay? Bring women into the workforce, bring women fully side by side with men into the economy. So, I mean, I think you know the solution to this, how to create more jobs for women and get them elected. First, we have to cut taxes on the richest white men in the country. Well, all the rich people, but it's mostly white men. So we cut taxes on white men and then cut benefits to the poor, who are disproportionately people of color and women. That's how we're going to do it. That's how we're going to get more women into my cabinet.
Show me what democracy looks like.
The term trickle-down economics, I know, is something that is also closely associated with neoliberalism. Do you know, like, what did that actually... Like, I know the basic idea is you funnel money into private enterprise. Private enterprise knows where to use the money in the best, most profitable, most efficient way for society. So if you do that, it's going to create jobs. The wealth is going to trickle down. It's actually called supply side economics, but sort of pejoratively called trickle down economics. This kind of also highlights the sort of welfare for the rich, markets for the poor ideology. It's a very like crystallized version of it, but I don't know what he actually did. Who did he give money to? You probably don't know. Hey?
Yes, actually, I know all about trickle down.
I'm a trickle down master.
Kind of a trickle down master. Yeah, so the idea of trickle down economics implemented by Reagan was the idea that huge tax cuts at the rich and getting more money to producers instead of consumers that would stimulate the economy and provide wealth for all, because the tax cuts for the rich would cause them to spend more money, which would then eventually end up going to poor people.
Yeah, everyone gets richer. Rising tide raises all boats. The one example I did actually just listen to a bunch of specifics on was the 2008 economic crash. He was basically describing it as like a sort of quintessential neoliberal example. So it starts off in the 90s with Bill Clinton deregulating the banking industry, Glass-Steagall being revoked, and sort of leading to this situation where mortgage sellers no longer really have any reason to care whether the people they're selling mortgages to can pay back the mortgages, because they just get the mortgages and then they sell them off into these repackaged commodities that are sold and traded on open markets.
Yeah, they called those liar's loans, right? Where you loan someone money that they couldn't possibly pay back. They called that a liar's loan internally. Like,
oh, wow.
The people at the banks called them liar's loans.
Liar's loans. So then, like, there's those things, but then that's sort of a bubble that's happening, and people realize that's about to collapse. So then they start taking out insurance policies on these packages of mortgages that are being bought and sold. So they're taking out insurance policies. Insurance companies are making lots of money, but these specific insurance companies weren't regulated as insurance companies, so they didn't actually have to keep the money on hand in order to pay back the companies who are taking out the insurance policies if these mortgages that were eventually going to collapse actually did collapse. So they just were able to keep selling packages and packages without ever having a principal that they needed to pay them back. And then those insurance policies were also bought and sold on the market called credit default swaps. And so it's just this whole like incestual like pig orgy of money and stuff going on. And it collapses because it has to collapse. And so there's all this deregulation happens that allows this horrible bubble and the bubble popping to collapse. And then what is the response from the government is to bail out the companies that did all those things and to pass only like token legislation to prevent any of the same things from happening again. And from most accounts, most of those same things are still happening. It became safer to participate in it because the idea now is that the government will cover our backs when this collapses again. So that was described to me as a sort of like quintessential example of neoliberalism. All this deregulation's going on, and then when it fucks up, the government steps in to help out the corporations. Although in a thread on Facebook, some people were telling me that that's actually not neoliberalism at all, because the government pumping money into the private sector is Keynesianism. But this lecture I was listening to was saying that's the opposite of Keynesianism, because Keynesianism is pumping money into the working class through infrastructure projects and education and Medicare, welfare projects, welfare state.
Yeah, there's kind of like a definition wobble with all this economic stuff in particular. It becomes really hard to be confident because you feel like when you're hearing these like conflicting definitions of things, it's kind of like having the ground shift underneath you, and then you feel like you're wrong or crazy.
So if anything I've said is wrong according to the way you see things, you're probably right. You're great. Send us a message about it. But
call that
I'm sorry.
hotline.
Call that hotline. Tell us why we're wrong.
Yeah, and really central to the neoliberal economy and project is financialization, which is when the power and influence of the financial sector of the economy is increasing and growing. So that's what's been happening all over the world since the Reagan era. And it has a lot of negative effects because banks are a service market. A bank is a place that you can store your money. It's not
a product. It's not like a TV.
Yeah, and some economists that I've read have suggested that having a large financial market is just really bad for the economy. It makes no sense to put all of that incentive and all of that money into the financial sector when it could be going into technology or other things. Because like right now there's a situation where intelligent people going to university going to go and contribute to society or put into a situation where they can, choose between doing things that matter, that they care about, or mastering these weird trading mechanisms of the marketplace and making more money and contributing to the further growth of this market, which I don't have the stats on hand, but it's been growing as percentage of GDP every year since the 80s.
Yeah. Can we just eliminate it? Like, can we just, like, what would we have to do to fix not all of neoliberalism, but just this super dense growing financial market, like the buying and trading of credit default swaps and selling in the stock markets and the hedge fund manager, just these people who make money, like moving money around. Can we just utopian? What do we do to like swipe that all out in one fell swoop without fucking up like the way real businesses get money? Like I understand stock markets are a useful thing because they're like poor understanding of the stock market.
I'm open to abolitionist narratives for all this stuff. It doesn't sound
could we abolish the stock market?
I think we could at least change it, like,
because I mean, now that we have crowdfunding, do we even need stock markets? Because the whole thing that I think is the problem is that stock markets allow for this meta level of trading. Stocks themselves become a commodity. It's not just a piece of company you're buying, but they're like bought and sold on their own terms for these dollar values. And then there's like the derivatives thing where you're betting on the future success of stocks or of companies. And all these weird meta levels. Like can we just like, it's probably overly simplistic and just displaying my lack of understanding of the whole topic, but we could just chop that whole pyramid off. Just all those extra levels at the top. Like investment's cool. I'm down with investing in things, but this whole stock market thing and needing your stock to grow, and the fact that that's why you need to keep making more profit each and every month and each and every quarter and each and every year. You can't think in these more long-term terms or just in the idea that being a successful company is enough and that you don't have to keep growing your stock price constantly all the time. Like it's not enough to make a profit, but the profits have to grow each and every month, and how that's tied to the stock market.
I'm not an expert. I don't have the detailed plan out. I'm not running for president on this platform, but I think we can abolish it. If we get together a group of experts, people who really know the ins and outs of this shit, and we talk to them, there's going to be certain things that we can make illegal right away, phase out heavily taxed to the point where they're not incentivized anymore, and phase these things out in favor of a more production economy or information economy instead of a financial sector economy. I think that they are parasitic. It's a parasitic industry, the financial industry. They're collecting economic rents. They're playing the role of middlemen. They're not contributing anything to society. And the financial sector, banking, has a very simple use. It's a place to store your money. It shouldn't be a zillion-dollar industry. It shouldn't be the most profitable sector. It makes no sense. There's a type of corruption. What the issue is regulatory capture. The idea that members of the industry are the ones regulating that industry through lobbying and ties to the political establishment. Wall Street and financial sectors around the world are in charge of regulating, setting policy on their own businesses, and there are perverse incentives there. And that is something that needs to be dismantled. And it's going to require a lot of research and analysis that I don't have with me, but it's absolutely possible.
One of the examples of that was in that same explanation of the 2008 crash that what you were saying just reminded me of was that the rating agencies that rated the quality of these packages of mortgages that were being bought and sold as like, oh, AAA, great investment, buy them. All those rating agencies were being paid by the people creating them and selling the mortgages. So you're selling these, what did you call them? Liars loans? Liars loans?
Liars loans, yeah.
Yeah, so you're selling liars loans. You know they're liars loans. That's what you call them. And then you're like, okay, we got a company right here, our best friend, and this company says these liars loans are great investments, AAA.
It's also tied to the idea of rent seeking, which is lobbying the government as an investment to get the government to tweak the rules to get a return on investment from your lobbying. So like, by financing Ted Cruz's campaign for president, I spend $1 million now, but he gets in office, changes the financial rules around, and allows me to make $8 million a year. It was a good investment. That's rent seeking.
Yeah, right.
Here's just a little quote from an email from the ratings agency Standard & Poor's, one of the places where they mispriced the risk of the liars loans. Because what they did was like give out shitty loans, pretend that they were good loans, and then they were able to actually understand in secret those were bad loans and bet against them. So make money on people defaulting on those loans, which is one of the reasons that the financial crisis happened. So it's a clusterfuck of corruption that is complicated to describe so people don't have to go to jail for it. As long
right.
As long as it sounds complicated, you're fine. Just don't get caught strangling someone. So yeah, there's this quote from an email from Standard & Poor's. One of the guys says to another, "Let's hope we're all wealthy and retired by the time this house of cards falters," adding the emoticon, :O, end bracket. So a little smiley with a big round nose.
Oh, gosh.
"Let's hope we're all wealthy and retired by the time this house of cards falters." Which house of cards are you talking about? What do you mean? Wealthy and retired? What do you mean? What are you talking about?
You mean the economy?
Yeah. Do you mean that you're doing corruption right now?
No, is there something corrupt about building houses of cards? You a fascist, Shawn? Are you saying people shouldn't be able to take a card and put it on a table and build a house with it?
So here's another one. When the LIBOR rates were being manipulated.
Oh, yeah. What was that again?
LIBOR rates are the standardized interest rates that banks loan to one another. And there was a scandal that it came out that they were brazenly being manipulated for people's private gain. And in one of the emails that came out from one Barclays employee to another as they manipulate LIBOR was, "Done for you, big boy."
Oh, God.
So there's kind of like a bro culture in the financial sector around like casual little corruption and like sending winky faces to each other.
It's like the kind of relationship you imagine when someone up in the president's administration is like going to visit their friend who's a judge, and it's just like, we just need this warrant to do this thing that's basically illegal, but it's for a really good reason. And they're like, yeah, I know you. Of course it's for a good reason. Here, that's not really that illegal if we think about it this way. Yeah, you're right. Let's think about it that way. It's signed for you, big boy.
I want to summarize what financialization is because it's another big word and it's got a few concepts associated with it. So during financialization in the 1980s, companies started turning away from banks and turning towards financial markets like investment from the public. Banks started using customers as a source of profit and started doing high-risk, complex activities called investment banking, which I'm pretty sure is when you are...
Not just storing the money, but investing it in things?
Yeah. At this time, consumers became direct participants in financial markets with credit cards, overdrafts, mortgages, student loans, and car loans becoming a part of everyday life. Profit in the economy is being made less by employing workers or providing goods and services, but increasingly lending money. And also at this time, all simple forms of finance now generate a market in complex finance higher up the chain. Every house buyer or car driver is generating a noble financial return somewhere in the system. Your mobile phone contract, gym membership, household energy, all your regular payments are packaged into financial instruments, generating steady interest for an investor, and somebody you have never met will place a bet on whether or not you will make payments. That's part of the system as part of financialization. And this summary of financialization, also I want to give credit where it's due, comes from Paul Mason. So that system, which I think was created out of people trying to maximize their self-interest through regulatory capture and make it as easy as possible to continue making as much money as possible, had the unintended, hopefully, side effect of reducing the amount of capital going into production in general and contributing to wage stagnation in the rest of the economy. So financialization is pretty bad stuff, and it's a core part of neoliberalism.
You know what I see? The problem of this last economic crisis, financial crisis, 2008.
Right.
What the right-wingers don't admit is that, I'm sorry, but this was not some social democrat spending too much money. This was a crisis of the lack of regulation. Once I wrote an ironic article, to that Ayn Rand question, who is John Galt? Mm-hmm. This is John Galt crisis. Mm-hmm. Alan Greenspan was an objectivist. Mm-hmm. So, you see, how to put it, we should stop this myth. For me, the big result, what people should learn from 2008 financial crackdown, is that neoliberalism first is a myth.
Yeah.
First, if you look all around the world, but the role of the state is not diminishing. If anything, it's diminishing where it should be more.
But I'd add one thing, though. Alan Greenspan, though, should have known better. I'm not going to let you let him off the hook completely. That's not.
No, I'm not. Okay. I think that he's co-responsible.
Sure. All right, got it.
But I think that it's precisely because of his objectivism.
Right.
So again, it's not, it's incredible ideological operation how somehow this the fundamentalist Republicans almost convinced us you see too much spending, too much state regulation. Right. No, it was quite the opposite.
Boo, 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 boo. Here's an interlude just to be confusing. Originally, the word neoliberalism referred to something else, a type of moderate, pragmatic market ideology, not market fundamentalism. That was the way the term was most often used originally. It wasn't until the 1980s where it started being used in such a negative sense, which is another source of confusion of this polysyllabic word.
I didn't know that. That didn't come up in my my minor research.
The term neoliberalism was first coined by the Freiburg School of German economists to denote a philosophy that was explicitly moderate in comparison to classical liberalism, both in its rejection of laissez-faire policies and in its emphasis on humanistic values. Supporters of a more traditional form of liberalism, such as Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, were referred to by the neoliberals as paleoliberals for clinging to an outdated faith in unfettered markets. They sought to divorce liberalism, the freedom of individuals to compete in the marketplace, from laissez-faire, freedom from state intervention. They argued that laissez-faire state policies stifle competition and the strong devour the weak. They favored a policy where the government emphasized access to markets through its policies.
I like that.
Me too. It's a great idea. I mean,
it sounds kind of like what I would associate with social liberalism, I believe is the word. But yeah, no, I like it.
Welcome to Keyboard Warrior Radio Theater.
Oh my God, everyone, you should totally check out this Naomi Klein video. She totally destroys neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, blech, I hate it.
Hey there, friend. Wasn't sure if I was going to say something about this because I admire your activism and I also admire Naomi Klein quite a bit, but I've always had a great deal of trouble embracing the term neoliberal. It was first used in ways that are completely the opposite of the way that it's used now. And even if you take it down piece by piece, neo and liberal, semantically, the combination of words, it doesn't seem to break down to describing what it purports to describe. And I just generally find it to be a confusing term. Anyways, I don't mean to be a bother, but this is on my mind, and I don't think I'm the only one who feels this way.
It's not a bother at all. Thank you so much for commenting and offering your perspective. I guess the reason I think neoliberal is actually a useful term is, well, one, a lot of academics I respect use it to describe a specific set of ideas in practice in the real world, and so it's easier to use the same words other people are using. And the specific neoliberal breakdown, I get that it can be confusing, but it is the way that the old liberal ideology was used in a new way starting in the 1980s. The new application of liberalism in the world is a way that I think about it so that it makes sense.
I'm certainly willing to engage in that shared thought process with you to improve our communication. Often on the internet, I think people don't take the time to show each other that they were heard. And I certainly feel that I've been heard fairly and responded to in a very rational way. And I find your points compelling. I guess what's confusing to me is like, what is even meant by neoliberalism? It seems to me that in many cases that I've encountered uses of the word neoliberalism, there hasn't been a clear definition presented. I hate to be so negative, but I would even wager that some of these people couldn't even define the word if they were asked to, which I find concerning from an intellectual perspective. We want to make sure that people are aware of the meanings of the words that they're using, obviously. So what is meant by neoliberalism, and how could it be useful to me?
I'm going to be a little bit annoying and just say that, first of all, I don't know how much of a problem it is, even if someone doesn't have a definition for neoliberalism. I think a lot of the way that we learn about words is through associations in context. And so I think people can have a sense of what words mean without knowing a specific definition. In fact, I think that's how we learn about words all the time, always, and definitions are sort of a post hoc attempt to explain what we're doing when we use words in the way I just described. But I digress, and I apologize for that pedantic point. What I understand the term neoliberalism to mean is a sort of free market fundamentalist ideology or rhetoric applied selectively through policies like privatization, funneling money from social programs to police and industry subsidies. Policies that systematically benefit and give welfare and handouts to the rich while simultaneously putting stress and strain and defunding programs that would benefit the poor in the name of free market principles. Do you have any suggestions for ways I can talk about this phenomena without using that word?
Thanks for sharing those particular insights. It's clear that you've studied this issue and you've chosen to take the time to try to educate me, even though you're under no obligation to. To me personally, I feel like there are some solutions which are state solutions and some solutions which are market solutions that fit differently in different parts of the economy and have different benefits and drawbacks and should be analyzed individually rather than saying that one is greater or worse than the other. But that's just my personal point of view. And when I hear the use of neoliberalism this way as a pejorative, I instinctively want to defend my conception of markets as I see them reflected in the current world. It makes it harder for me to listen to what the other person is saying. It sounds to me, if I were to put it nakedly, that the problem that you're describing could be better described as oligarchy, an antagonistic oligarchy that keeps the poor around as long as they're useful for their human capital, but has no humanist drive to support them. The reason I would prefer the use of the term oligarchy is, to me, it seems more descriptive. It doesn't say that oligarchy is good or bad. It's talking about very specifically rule by the rich. Would you consider using the word oligarchy in the future?
I love your idea about analyzing individual situations for the costs and benefits of market or state solutions. And I think that various countries around the world have reached better balances than we have here in the United States. I think that Switzerland and Sweden are two examples of countries like that. I totally understand why you would want to use the word oligarchy, but the reason I would caution against it is because I think it projects a false image of how much power the rich actually have. I think what we have is not a rule by the rich, but a rule by elected officials who have been convinced by a false free market ideology to believe that it is beneficial for them to continue to produce policy that favors the rich. It's not an oligarchy in the sense that the rich are literally our kings. All we have to do is elect different people.
Well, I can't argue with any of that. I suppose you're always free to communicate the way that you wish. This has been an enlightening conversation, and unfortunately I can't keep this up because I've got a date tonight, and I need to start getting ready to look my best. I met this person at a local meeting of intellectuals that I go to on every second Tuesday where we talk about world politics. It's not exactly a dating get-together, but we found that we have a lot in common and really kind of hit it off.
Good luck. Keep me updated, winky face. So glad to hear that your love life has picked up from that lull.
Her name is Susan. One of the first topics that we really bonded over was a shared love of Buckminster Fuller.
I love Bucky.
Hey, you stay away from her. Just kidding. I am a polyamorous man. Are you?
I am, but I'm a homosexual, so I won't be joining you and your girlfriend. Unless you'd like to join me alone?
Sticker. Pride man with dog. We'll see how things go tonight with Susan.
Okay, well, enjoy your date. Have fun.
I look forward to it. I really should get going, though.
Yeah, stop. Why do you keep commenting?
I've got a lot of preparation to do, so I have to go.
Oh, sorry if I'm keeping you. It's been so much fun.
I'm doing this myself. Honestly, I'm having a great time. It's not your fault, but I really should get going.
Ha 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 ha. Oh, you.
Okay, gotta go now.
Go. Come on, stop.
And we'll see you next time for another episode of Keyboard Warrior Radio Theater.
I need to say this at some point in the episode, which is that privatization is sold to us as a decrease in the size of the government. It is sold to us through the logic of the marketplace and through the premise that government inherently mismanages things and the free market can do it better. Privatization is, by its very definition, an anti-democratic process. It takes away democratic access to this industry from the people and puts it into the control of private groups. By definition, that's what's happening in privatization, without a doubt. On another level, you are engaging in the most egregious type of government corruption, which is insider dealing and not getting the best deal possible for the government.
Privatization could exist without that?
No, I think by definition you actually can't, because the people buying something from the public sector are looking to get a return on their investment. So they won't invest unless they are sure that they're going to get a return on their investment, which means that there's more money to be had in keeping it than there is in selling it, by definition. Otherwise, the privatization wouldn't happen. No one privatizes industries that are not profitable. This fits into the neoliberal paradigm of privatized gains, socialized losses, socialized costs. So privatization is the most egregious form of big government insider corruption. It's an increase in the mandate of the government to unilaterally sell things that belong to everyone, belong to the people, to private corporations to make profit off of. And another crucial thing to understand here is that those who want to sell and privatize things have no incentive to make those things work. So what you can do is have one government sabotage the effectiveness of something like an energy industry, a nuclear power plant, telecommunication services, whatever. You don't give them the funding they need. You impose regulations on them that make it hard for them to do their job. You cause that industry to fail. You create a crisis. And then your solution to the crisis is then to sell it to someone else who implements the basic reforms that are necessary to make it functional again, which were always an option to the government. And then in addition to that, jack up prices, which then go to private individuals instead of the government budget, which means that in effect, privatization raises taxes in the long term.
The one thing I think I would say was that as someone who has what I think of as an anti-government streak in me, a little bit of a anarchist, quasi-libertarian streak in me, when I think about taking something out of the hands of the government, I like to think of that as a good thing. Like, my ideal school system isn't a government school system, but I think it's very important to think about when you're taking something out of the hands of the government, what are you putting it into the hands of? And if the answer is wealthy, profit-seeking institutions, corporations, top 1%, that's the wrong place to be putting it into the hands of. The place to be putting it into the hands of is the control of the people who are going to be affected by it. So what I would call real democratic institutions or real participatory institutions. So I'm not necessarily against taking things out of the hands of the state, but I think it matters who you're putting it into the hands of.
Yeah, and I could concede, well, I generally have more pro-state inclinations than you. That I could concede that taking a publicly owned energy source and then putting it administratively in the hands of the workers and managers who are involved, that makes sense. The two addendums that I would put on that are that a lot of these things require startup capital that comes from the government in the first place, and that is something that needs to be acknowledged and maybe paid back in some way. Like it could be to the benefit of everyone to start up industries like that, start up power plants, then shift them to the control of the workers and have a profit sharing scheme that returns a portion of the profits to the financiers, which were democratically funded over time. And then also I think that, like you said, everyone who is a stakeholder in a project should have a say in it, which means that it should not only be workers managing, but ideally also consumers who have a say in what happens. Because the interests of those who maintain something like an energy monopoly versus the interests of those who consume energy underneath that monopoly are going to be different.
It's rather striking to see how every element of the neoliberal package is specifically designed to undercut democracy. It's rarely discussed, and people talk about its economic effects. But just think it through. If you have no constraints on capital flow, that creates what international economists sometimes call a virtual parliament of investors and lenders who can, I'm quoting from technical literature, it can carry out a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies. And if they think the policies are irrational, they can vote against them by capital flight or by a tax on the currencies and so on. The policies that are irrational are, by definition, those that benefit people but don't improve profit and market access and so on. And therefore governments face what's called a dual constituency, their own population and the virtual parliament. And the virtual parliament usually wins, especially in poor countries. And the same is true of other elements of the neoliberal programs. So take, say, privatization, which became a mantra. Well, by definition, privatization undercuts democracy, takes something out of the public arena and puts it into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies that are created and supported by the state, which is what corporations are.
So, blow up the banks? Is that the answer? Will that do something?
I don't think there's any physical bank you can blow up.
What if we blew up literally every physical bank?
I mean, if you could get the resources and the time together to do this. I think what you would have happening is, because we're under this neoliberal paradigm, everyone like you and I would lose their money and everyone rich would be compensated for the loss.
That's that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay, so we're not going to blow up the banks. Oh man, when you just said under this neoliberal paradigm, it reminded me of someone else on the Facebook thread about this was like, neoliberalism, the cultural Marxism of the left. And when you said under this neoliberal paradigm, it reminded me of how when I listen to people who believe in something called cultural Marxism talk, they talk about how the whole world has just been like spiraling onto this terrible progressive socialist leftist overarching nightmare world for the last 50 years or whatever. And it's just so interesting to me that there are people who look at the state of the world and see it as this gradual takeover of the left and of left-wing ideology resulting in what we have right now, this quintessentially leftist world, the result of leftism right here, everyone. And then there's the neoliberal, or just more generally, the sort of anti-capitalism idea, which is that these right-wing capitalist ideologies have taken over the world last 40 or 50 years, and everything's being privatized, blah, 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 blah. We've ended up in this awful result of right-wing policy. Thanks the right for this. And I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with definition wobble and also being far off the end of the spectrum on either side. Like, to you, Bernie looks like a center-right pragmatist, but so it's like, what does the real world look like from where you are? And these two all-consuming narratives, the cultural Marxism and neoliberalism.
Yeah, I think people always have a tendency towards trying to create a simplified map of the world. So there is a similar thing going on between the pattern of the way that people talk about neoliberalism and the way that people would talk about cultural Marxism in different subcultures.
Yeah, I think anytime you make up a framework like that, you can kind of interpret the entire world within that framework. Like, if your framework is anti-capitalism, neoliberalism, you can take any part of the world and interpret it under that framework, and there'll probably be some bits of pieces of information that don't fit in, and so you just kind of ignore those ones or discredit them or whatever. And it's the same thing for cultural Marxism. It's how ideology affects the way people look at the world. Like, I mean, you can take the whole world and look at it under like patriarchy theory, or just like even conspiracy thinking. Even people who are like skeptics, like that's just an overarching way of looking at the world. Everything gets filtered through your thing. There's lots of them, and we all have multiple different ones to different degrees. And I think like all of them to varying different degrees have valid things to offer. And I mean, I have my own biases as to which ones are more valid and less valid.
Yeah, just this is a side note, but the idea of like I have a bias towards which ones I prefer. There's an interesting type of misleading humility there, because I don't have biases. It's not a result of me having some drive to want to believe one of them.
You're mistaking my repugnant postmodern relativism for humility.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
But since we brought up cultural Marxism, maybe it would be fun to trace the ideological roots of neoliberalism.
You're going to give me some narrative here? A story? You can tell me a story?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you a story. Good. The facts I'm going to tell you are true, but the narrative is going to be a story.
Right. Good. That's how I like to get my facts.
So this is going to be some quotes and paraphrases from the subchapter, The Neoliberal Thought Collective, from Inventing the Future. Okay, so just before World War II, there was something called the Walter Lippmann Colloquium, which brought together classic liberal theorists, new German Ordo liberals, the British LSE liberals, and Austrian economists such as Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. It was an organization to acknowledge the problem of rising collectivism and to develop and spread a new liberalism, but it was kind of stopped by World War II, but they continued to network and work towards developing this neoliberalism. In 1945, Hayek started the Mont Pelerin Society, which was a closed intellectual network that provided the basic ideological infrastructure for neoliberalism to ferment. It is no exaggeration to say that almost all of the important figures in the post-war creation of neoliberalism were in attendance at its first meeting in 1947, including the Austrian economists, the UK liberals, the Chicago School, the German Ordo liberals, and a French contingent. The MPS was consciously focused on changing political common sense, and it sought to develop a liberal utopia. Hayek wrote that the purpose of the MPS was to enlist the support of the best minds in formulating a program which has a chance of gaining general support. Our effort therefore differs from any political task in that it must be essentially a long-term effort, concerned not so much with what would be immediately practicable, but with the beliefs which must gain ascendance if the dangers are to be averted which at the moment threaten individual freedom. The Society made a commitment to a long-run war of position in the battle of ideas. Privatized strategic elite deliberation was therefore established as the modus operandi. Hayek defined the central goal of the MPS as changing elite opinion in order to establish the parameters for within which public opinion could then be formed, the Overton Window. They wanted to take what was thought of as political common sense of the rulers of the countries, focusing specifically on changing the ideas of people in power. So the MPS didn't work at the grassroots level, it worked at the opposite level. They had a clear strategic idea that they wanted to occupy elite opinion because then they could change political common sense.
And I'm guessing it was successful.
It would seem
It would seem like it was successful. Yeah. Did it turn out well? Did the MPS, the Mont
Pelerin Society,
does it still exist, or?
I think so, yeah. And so these guys were anti-Keynesian in a system that was dominated by Keynesian economics. So the strategy set out by them and spearheaded by Hayek was an intentional long-term strategy, which involved the establishment of think tanks to spread neoliberal ideas around the world, which were networked through something called the Atlas Society.
Just like Atlas Shrugged?
Also, at the same time, they were working to specifically get society members into government positions. That strategy eventually produced 3 heads of state and a large number of cabinet ministers. So the MPS did achieve political power. They established think tanks like the Institute for Economic Affairs, the Fraser Institute here in Canada, and the MIPR in the United States. These think tanks were focused on who Hayek called the second-hand dealers in ideas: journalists, academics, writers, broadcasters, and teachers, because he thought they dictated the long-term thinking of the nation, and by convincing them, you could convince everyone. Over time, when they did reach out to the public, they created pamphlets that were meant to be accessible. The texts were written in a utopian fashion without regard for whether a policy was capable of being implemented at the moment. The goal was to always redefine the definitions of the possible in the long term.
They're just like us. They're just doing what we wanted to do, except they had a lot more money and a different outcome.
Yeah, I think there's a lesson to be taken from the story of the spread of these neoliberal ideas, which is who we're convincing of things matters. I don't know, it's just an interesting kind of alternative strategy for political organizing to target elite opinions and journalism and shift the boundaries of discussion in society to affect public opinion. And the fact that they were able to do it successfully over time, I think, shows that it's a good strategy.
Yeah, I think that it repeatedly shows itself to be a good strategy. And I think it's actually pretty heartening that shifting that Overton window is now something that's easier for people with less money to do. Mm-hmm. Whereas like more grassroots movements can make noise on Twitter and get their ideas out there.
Yeah, and this is kind of one of the takeaways in this Inventing the Future book, which I'm a big fan of right now, of how we can take this premise and then apply it to our political projects. Milton Friedman famously said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depends on the ideas that are lying around." In the instance of neoliberal policies, the crisis that they took advantage of was stagflation, which is when you have rising inflation and rising unemployment at the same time. And the reason that's a crisis is because in Keynesian economics, the solutions for those two different problems are considered opposites. If unemployment was rising, you put money into the economy, and if inflation is rising, you take money out. If both of the things were happening at the same time, there was a Keynesian confusion about what to do. You're supposed to both take money out and put money in at the same time. But Inventing the Future, he argues, our goal as long-term successful social movements is to develop alternatives to existing policies and keep them alive and keep them available and keep them in people's minds until they go from the realm of politically impossible to politically possible. And he argues that's how neoliberalism succeeded.
Since we were talking about the way these ideas were able to become the standard, I just wanted to quickly go over what the Washington Consensus was, because it's actually pretty interesting. This is the first line of the Wikipedia. The Washington Consensus is a set of 10 economic policy prescriptions considered to constitute the standard reform package for crisis-racked developing nations by Washington, D.C.-based institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the U.S. Treasury Department. So it's just like crisis-racked developing countries. So there's a crisis going on. Let's go in, and we got these 10 standard positions that have now become standard. The 10 positions are fiscal policy discipline, avoidance of large fiscal deficits relative to GDP. So that's austerity. That's cut welfare, cut educate, cut whatever you can. Don't spend government. You have to be responsible and not spend more than you're making. So number 1, austerity. Number 2, redirection of public spending from subsidies towards broad-based provision of, this contradicts what I was just saying. From subsidies towards broad-based provision of key pro-growth, pro-poor services like primary education, primary healthcare, and infrastructure investment.
Yeah, so the interesting, when I read this, the guy who wrote the original cited Washington Consensus.
Yeah, these 10 things that I just started reading.
Yeah, some of them that are included, people tend to follow under what is criticized as neoliberalism, but other ones tend to not be followed, and that's one of the ones that tends not to be followed under the paradigm of neoliberalism. And he's specified, I think, about the concept of the Washington Consensus and the way that it's currently used as like market fundamentalism, as he wants to differentiate his policy suggestions from what's typically criticized as neoliberalism, because it is still his contention that if you follow all of these rules, which isn't typically done, that you'll achieve growth and balance.
So there's a kind of commonly understood Washington Consensus, which doesn't, it's kind of fudgy with which ones of these it actually follows.
Yeah, the Washington Consensus that's usually criticized favors the things on the list that benefit the rich and disfavors the things that benefit the poor.
And I mean, to be honest, like when I read through these, the second one there just kind of, I think I skipped over it when I was reading them before or whatever. It just jumped out and I was like, oh, that's interesting. But read the rest of them. 3 was tax reform, broadening the tax base and adopting moderate marginal tax rates, which means like not taxing the rich too much. Number 4, interest rates that are market determined and positive in real terms. I don't know what that means. 5, competitive exchange rates. 6, trade liberalization of imports. 7, liberalization of inward foreign direct investment. So transnational companies investing in taking your oil out of your land for you and profiting from it. 8, privatization of state enterprises. 9, deregulation. And 10, legal security for property rights. So 8, 9 out of 10 of them, I feel like fit right in to what I think of as neoliberalism.
Yeah, but funding schools and infrastructure.
Yeah, that one definitely sticks out like a sore thumb of not what I was expecting. I think, again, because I didn't read it when I read it the first time.
Yeah, so for people who think that Bernie Sanders isn't a center-right pragmatist, read the Washington Consensus.
Yeah, no, totally.
It was neoliberal policies or something rather like them that created the third world. If you go back to, say, the 18th century, the centers of the world economy were China, India mostly, and it changed. The differences between the rich and the poor were nowhere near like today. Europe grew and developed, first England and the United States, Germany, Italy, and so on. They developed by radically violating what are now called neoliberal principles, strong states, direct intervention in the economy, and so on. India and later China were devastated, and the same is true of what we now call the third world. How? By forced imposition of market principles. And this is furthermore well known. So if you read serious economic historians, Paul Baroche, for example, he simply points out protectionism and state intervention created the rich and developed societies. He doesn't call it neoliberalism, but forced liberalization pretty much created the third world.
Hey everyone, it's time for the Seriously Wrong Book Club. It's where the books go to be read.
They just walk right in. They just...
Who's that at the door? Who is that? Let's open the door, the book door, and let the book in. Who are you, little book?
Oh, that's so stupid.
Oh, hi. Today's book club pick is Postcapitalism by Paul Mason. I first became aware of Paul Mason when he was covering Syriza for The Guardian His book is called Postcapitalism, and the statement of the book is basically that we are at the beginning of a transition phase. We're mistaking info-capitalism, that is neoliberal capitalism, with the influence of the information economy, global networking. He's saying that is being mistaken as the final form of capitalism, but in reality, what is happening is through the information economy, the system that lies beyond capitalism is starting to infect capitalism and destroy it. And the next version of society is something like a post-scarcity utopia.
I love it. It's a virus. It's infecting capitalism. It's a very special virus that replaces its host with a new, better version of the host. So it's like a virus for humans that only infects Hitler and replaces him with Paul Mason, the author of this book.
Paul Mason says that we are slowly figuring out that an information economy is not compatible with a capitalist economy. Here is a quote from Postcapitalism. Once you can copy and paste something, it can be reproduced for free. It has, in economic speak, a zero marginal cost. If you're trying to own a piece of information, whether you're a rock band or a turbofan manufacturer worried about patents, your problem lies in the fact that it does not degrade with use, that one person consuming it does not prevent another person consuming it. Economists call this non-rivalry. A simpler word for it would be shareable. The interplay between supply and demand does not come into the price of an iTunes track. The supply of Beatles' Love Me Do on iTunes is infinite. The price doesn't change as demand fluctuates either. Apple's absolute legal right to charge 99 pence is what sets it apart. Only intellectual property law and a small piece of code in the iTunes track prevent everybody on Earth from owning every piece of music ever made. Apple's mission statement, properly expressed, is to prevent the abundance of music. So yeah, neoliberalism, our seven-syllabic friend. 7 syllables. Seven syllables of that
long
sweet
word,
juice.
academic jargon, that sweet academic jargon that we all know and love.
I don't have a solution for it, but with all of these different sub-definitions of neoliberalism, maybe it would be possible to tweak the words that we're using to be more convincing, less confusing, and easier for people of various education levels to embrace. Because I think there's a weird paradox in the left that on one hand, it's about the workers and the people, average everyday people. On the other hand, average everyday working people aren't likely to come home from the factory, sit down, and want to read critiques of neoliberalism.
Yeah, I think if you are passionate about this kind of stuff and you want to talk about it and use the word neoliberalism in your day-to-day life, I think it's a good idea for you to just get a few go-to definitions ready, because it is a word that has a lot of confusion surrounding it, and it'll be good if you can just explain to people what you mean by it. So I mean, if you're talking to a fellow leftist, you might say, oh, it's these ideas of austerity, trickle-down economics, privatization of everything, commodification of everything. If you're talking to a right-wing person, a market lover, you might say, oh, it's kind of like market rhetoric mixed with crony capitalist policies that benefit the big corporations that are in bed with government. And they'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, I hate neoliberalism too. If that's what it means, that's what I'm against. I'm against cronyism. And then you can just all come together and hold hands in a big leftist kumbaya circle, fight neoliberalism together.
I was trying to think of a simple, a Trumpian, because Trump speaks at a 4th grade reading level, and I've felt really inspired by that.
Yeah.
Because you listen to him talk, and it does this hypnotic effect. There's all these vague things you can project onto, and I don't know. I'd like to be able to get that speaking style. And I was trying to think of what neoliberalism could be approximated to in less syllables, and the best I got was the bad plan.
Is welfare too big a word? No, that's only 2 syllables. Welfare for the rich. I don't want to say markets for the poor. That's maybe a little too obtuse, but
it's handouts for the rich, and it's
handouts. Yeah, it's good.
Struggle. What's
like a not a punishment, but austerity, but not fucking austerity. A word that's not austerity.
Maybe punishment's kind of the right. Oh yeah, handouts for the rich, and poor people are getting punished.
Yeah.
End with the big, that's what Trump would do, is end on the polysyllabic word, say punished a couple times throughout it. Like, they're just being punished.
Yeah.
Poor people are just being punished. Say it like 3 or 4 times. Always end the sentence on it.
Rich people make away with the big bucks, lots of money, get all the handouts.
They're filling their wallets.
They're all at the punch bowl, filling their wallets with punch, and then the poor people are just punished over and over again. They're getting punished here, punished there, punished left and right. They just punish them. They just punish them all the time. It's constant. They call me. The poor people, they call me all the time. They say, Aaron, we're just getting punished out here. What can we do about it?
And I'm telling you, we need a good plan. This plan that started with, Reagan and Thatcher, and where you got these Wall Street guys walking away with tons of money while the poor people are being punished. We need a good plan. This is a bad plan.
The whole time they're just talking free markets. That's all they're talking about. But they don't care about free markets. They just care about getting the punch, filling their punch bowls into their wallets.
These politicians are making it so the corporations are kings. I think the people should be the kings, not the corporations.
Yeah, the monarchy of all. Everyone's a monarch.
Every man a king. So if you're wondering what someone is talking about when they say neoliberalism, they're referring to 3 categories of things. They're talking about the ideology of everyone as part of a marketplace, where everyone is a rational financial actor, where people have worth so much as you can use them towards financial ends, and money measures everything. Money is the measure of success and failure. They're also referring to policies like privatization, erosion of the welfare state and budget cuts, tax cuts for the rich, and financialization, which is an increase in the financial industry. And also, crucially, they're referring to power relations. They're referring to power relations between the rich and the poor, where there's welfare for the rich while the poor are punished. Power relations between powerful countries and less powerful countries, where less powerful countries have to follow the dictates of the more powerful countries and participate in markets. And again, welfare for the powerful countries, the poor countries are punished. And this is lifted up through international trade agreements, copyright regimes, and the legal protection of corporations, multinational corporations, the privatization of the resources of poor countries by the corporations of rich countries. So when people talk about neoliberalism, that's what they're talking about. That's the definition. And it depends on context. You can figure out exactly what they're talking about, but that about covers it. Going to have some great conversations now that we all use the word neoliberalism every day, all day.
This becomes like Netflix. Just chill. Just neoliberalism.
Yeah. Hey, girl, you want to come over? You Tindering messaging someone like, oh, what are you up to tonight? Oh, nothing much. I'm just going to do some theory on
neoliberalism.
Criticize neoliberalism. You down? Oh, that's just a euphemism, but I'm in.
I catch your jive. I know what you're talking about.
There's no greater foreplay.
Handouts for the rich, punishing the poor.
Bring some condoms. Oh, man, it's so awkward when you are meeting up with someone from Tinder for neoliberalism and chill, and you haven't even consolidated your theory on the corrupting influence of finance capital, and you guys start making out. So annoying. It's like, I want to consolidate that theory on the corrupting influence on finance capital and then make out, like not partway through.
Huh? Well, it looks like we got to the bottom of it.
Another case is closed.
Case closed. Another one. Eventually, there'll have to be an episode where we don't solve it. Like that, I don't know. I never read Hardy Boys books, but if I was writing them, there would have been like that one book where they just couldn't solve the case, and it was like really, really unsatisfying, but for all the readers, but they kind of liked it anyway.
Like those episodes of Law and Order where the guy gets away.
Right, yeah.
But neoliberalism's still out there, undefined. Damn it.
Yeah, it didn't happen this time. This time, we're good. We're good too
detectives.
Good. We got to the bottom of it.
We were wearing our little hats, little detective hats.
In all honesty, we probably haven't gotten to the very bottom of it. I think we've penetrated a lot of the surface, though.
Mm-hmm. Still more research to be done.
Yeah, there's still more bottom. There's always new bottoms. You can always sink lower. Understanding. Mixing metaphors.
This has been the Seriously Wrong podcast. We do a podcast every single week because we love doing it and we like learning. And so if you like what we're doing and you want to support us, what I would really like this week, special little request, go to our Facebook page and just like invite your friends list. Just invite everyone. Be obnoxious. Invite them all at once. Worst case scenario, they say no. It's not going to negatively affect your friendship or anything. Like, how often do you get an invite to something that you don't care to like, but do you really say like, fuck that person? I never do. I just don't like it.
Yeah. No, it's generally fine unless you're doing this all the time anyway and you just annoy people with it. I mean, then you could probably still do it anyway because you do it all the time anyway. So
yeah, people know that about you.
Yeah.
So there's no one who should not do this.
No one gets off.
Our special homework this week, what I'd like to ask is that you invite all of your friends to like us on Facebook. Just as an experiment. If you don't want to do that, there's other ways you can support us. You can call our toll-free hotline, 1-866-770-8754, and let us know what you think of the show or ask us a question, which we'll try to answer on the show in the future. We've also got a contact form on our website, or you can donate to us on either Patreon or PayPal. And if you give us a sustaining donation, we will give you some bonus content, some bonus episodes, and also more bonus episodes in the future.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening.
Next time on the Seriously Wrong podcast, Aaron and Shawn invest in regulating the podcast industry and make a lot of that sweet, sweet money through regulatory capture.